one from our human capital and another from innovation panel, and they're braving again for another panel discussion. Please join me in welcoming Tabatha Bull and Salim Teja.
Great. Okay, colleagues, let's get at it. We have the easy job. Our job is to wrap up the whole day, to decide what threads there were that were common threads that we can pull out of this, and to pick up on the challenge then that Steve put forward to us to come up with recommendations that could be made to the Deputy Prime Minister. Let me start, and what we'll do is we'll start by talking a bit about the climate, the environment we're in, and then perhaps take a look at some of the recommendations that came out of the various panels and some of the threads that we may want to continue to focus on. Then we'll want to hear from you and get your ideas. What have we missed so far? What wasn't covered in the discussion? Or were there particular themes that came out in the discussion that you felt were particularly important? And then it's drinks. So this will keep us focused. Peter, let me start with you. I guess the first question is obviously this: is Canada in a crisis when it comes to our ability to compete in the global marketplace?
Perrin, let me make a couple of points on that. One is, everything is not broken. The other is, the most difficult challenge in public policy is dealing with incremental decline. And Canada has been attempting to deal with incremental decline. You saw the various comparators for, I would say, 2 decades. And governments have made a number of initiatives in that regard. And we've had a lot of conversation here about certain things that are green shoots. It's almost like I see a lot of notes but no music. And I would argue we have to be more ambitious about our goals and more modest about our capacity. And on the goals side, we have to remind ourselves that we are a confederation. And you can't talk about what the Government of Canada can do about all of the issues we dealt with today without recognizing there are also shared jurisdictional issues. The other point I'd like to make is that it is not just governments. It's the broader stakeholder group that needs to be involved. And that's an obligation I think we all should take back. And the final point I'd make is, I do believe we need a process, and the report from the Senate recommended a process, which we could get into if you like, where we establish some clear, defined, measurable objectives of what we hope to achieve, and then divide up the responsibility amongst the stakeholders necessary, including governments, to achieve that objective. I have in my mind, Tom, what we learned in the FTA process with SAGITs. They did it sectorally, not in an amorphous Canada way. And you had the stakeholders around the sectors, and by the way, we could use the sectors that Monique, the Industrial Strategy Council developed. We don't need to reinvent what are the sectors we should be focusing on. But I'd like to see governments sit down with the stakeholders of the sectors and say, okay, what are the achievable objectives by 2030 that you could all commit to? And then we start putting some of the music to the notes that we've talked about. So a stronger vision that's rooted in practical, measurable steps.
Okay, so the Senate Prosperity Group made your report over a year ago. What's happened?
Well, it is the chronic Canadian problem. You can go back to how many different reports have been cited here today. It's not that we don't know what needs to be done. It's that we haven't had the actors that are necessary to align themselves willing to proceed in that fashion. And I think it's too easy to blame just one government. I think this is a chronic Canadian problem. And I would suggest that the forces outside of government need to come together and stimulate that process. Otherwise, we'll be waiting for Godot. So I'm afraid the answer to your question is not much, other than perhaps another study. You've got Anne's group and Lisa's group pursuing their work. And I don't think that is, the ideas is not the problem. It's putting a table together that has all the actors necessary to achieve something aligned.
Okay, and that perhaps the fundamental question that we have to wrestle with in this session. One of the panelists earlier made the point earlier today that the recommendations that have come from the various studies that have been done have been essentially, if not identical, they've certainly been in parallel with each other. You had the Barton report. You had the Senate Prosperity Group, the Industry Strategy Council. I guess Tom Jenkins did work. I don't know how many other groups there's been. Yep. But all of the recommendations, if not identical, at least aligned with each other. And yet here we are in the same position, except that the gap between us and other countries has grown.
I think that's being overly pessimistic, which is also a Canadian characteristic. You're too Presbyterian. I think that there have been a number of initiatives, and some of them were talked about here proudly. Where would we be if we hadn't done the Canadian Foundation for Innovation? Where would we be if we didn't do the research chairs? Where would we be if we didn't have the genome investments that have been made over the last 20 years? My point is, we've got all of these little bits of notes that are important without the overarching music that aligns the notes. Then, of course, there are other things to do, don't get me wrong. But it's ironic. We have a government that is entitled to say they've achieved more, but they take far too much achievement for themselves. In other words, they've had more modest success than they would ascribe to themselves, and we don't want to give them any benefit for the things that have been done. And I think the reality is somewhere in between. This is a complex country to govern, and one in which the basic federalism isn't broadly understood. You know, one of the points I've made is that during the pandemic, we had 37 or 38 federal, provincial, territorial meetings on the pandemic. Couldn't we have 10 on the economy? Like, just
couldn't we have
an ambitious thought.
Economy?
Well, you know, but my point is, we need a broader lesson in civics across the actors of public policy.
You cite a number of programs which have been useful, which have been brought in over the course of the last several years. But is innovation, is productivity, is competitiveness essentially a series of spending programs? Is it a matter of a machine where tax dollars go in the top, you turn the crank, innovation, productivity, competitiveness comes out the bottom, or is it much more than that?
Well, of course it's more than that. And it's, you know, there were periods of time where the words productivity and innovation were verboten in this town. And, you know, that's a rather naive view in my estimation. And it brings discredit to the work that had been done. But I believe that it is absolutely necessary to focus on those issues. Now, how we focus on them today is different than how we did 20 years ago. You know, 20 years ago, we had our first national summit on innovation with provinces and stakeholders and all this. We never talked about the changing nature of work. Or immigration didn't have the profile it had. We did talk about interprovincial trade barriers, but the issues have evolved, but the commitment to coherence has been reduced. There was actually an agreement at that time amongst federal and provincial industry ministers, as they were then called, on what we were hoping to achieve as a country on innovation. And even the PQ government of Quebec signed on to that. That was all went by the way when we had a change of government who said, we're going to have in-your-lane federalism. Well, this country doesn't work with in-your-lane federalism.
Put yourself in the position that you are leading the delegation that we'll go to see the Deputy Prime Minister after this to summarize the results of our discussion and to put in front of her proposals that will help to make a tangible difference. What are the threads that came out of the conversation today that, first of all, what has she not heard before? What would you have to suggest that the government was likely to accept and act on?
I couldn't predict that. I don't know. I've not had a conversation with the Deputy Prime Minister on these subjects. She's certainly been made aware of the Senate report, but has not taken the occasion to meet with the senators involved. I guess I believe that on the process side, our report suggested the creation of a prosperity council, much like the old Economic Council of Canada, but with new nomenclature, which would help nurture what are the objectives, the comparative specific objectives we should have as a country across the jurisdictions and the sectors. And our report suggests what some of them might be. But if a government were prepared to lead such an initiative and give some collective objectives that they weren't alone responsible for delivery, but you could have a prosperity council that was speaking to both levels of government and other stakeholders about what needs to be done, I think that would be something that would change the conversation from the traditional Fed-Prov stuff or the view that only one level of government matters on these things. I think that we need an exogenous voice that's coherent and expert to bring some imagination to governments.
Just before I turn to our other colleagues, let's look at one other challenge then that Steve put to us. He set out in his opening comments today measures that government could take that didn't require writing checks. He argued that many of them would in fact result in, as a result of growth, they would result in an increase in revenues to government. Yet we've been unable to get action on those all of these years. What specific immediate actionable items, if you were, the Minister of Finance will be bringing down a budget in the spring. Some of the measures will involve check writing, but others can involve other changes being made.
Yeah.
What would you recommend that were short-term measures that would have a tangible effect and would build public support that we can make a difference?
I won't list the specific ones that came up today, but I would take what were observed in the human capital sections, both of them, and the linkage to immigration and perfecting the immigration system. Those would be short-term deliverables that are generally speaking aligned with the orientation of the government that could move this agenda. What I'm suggesting is that we actually need to have an overlay of a broader strategic objective that becomes a more shared objective by sector. But I think that there is a rich harvest here of very specific items. I would also point out that on the trade barriers, the interprovincial trade barriers, there's very little the Government of Canada can do anymore. The interprovincial trade barriers that are left are provincial. And I think it would be helpful for the stakeholder, academic, and business community to speak to their provinces. We've had disparity of views across provinces. But that, as Steve said, that's 4% of GDP that's lying on the sidewalk.
I certainly agree with you that when it comes to interprovincial barriers to trade, it's provinces that erect that. And I remember a story that was told by Minister Flaherty when he was Minister of Finance about the time when he had responsibility in Ontario for the dossier. He said we would meet with our other colleagues, we would get a report on all of the barriers that had gone up since our last meeting, and then we would go to dinner. And that's largely what has happened since that time. The federal government, in the case of the pandemic, used its spending power in an area of provincial jurisdiction to make massive interventions. Does it have the scope when it comes to interprovincial barriers or other regulatory reform to use tools such as the spending power to be able to cause change? Or can it create a registry of interprovincial barriers that will name and shame provinces that put these barriers in place?
Yeah, I think that the pandemic has given perhaps some greater courage to the Government of Canada. Now, it did have the advantage of being a crisis, but it did lead to not only spending initiatives, some very creative public policy, using, yes, the spending power, but again, the 37 or 38 federal, provincial, territorial first ministers conversations, which I think we learned some things about. We also lost the opportunity, I would suggest, to have a better civics lesson for Canadians. That in an area of shared jurisdiction, governments did not go out of their way to define what they were responsible for and what the other level of government was responsible for. And I think we need to have in the engagements that you can foresee in the future, a clearer sense of what the feds, with their spending power, ought to be able to achieve with that spending power, not just writing a check to the system, but writing a check with particular objectives for the take your pick, health care reform. What if the Fed said, we will underwrite the digitalization of health care? That's across Canada. That's not specific to a particular hospital. It's a change agent. I think that would be a heck of a lot more valuable from a public policy perspective than to say we're going to up the grants on health care. Similarly, on some of the innovation ideas that we're floating here, I think that the feds should continue to say, this is what we are doing. Now, we also need then some alignment with what the provinces are responsible for. And I do believe at those tables, you need a stronger voice of the private sector, which I go back to what was so good about the Industry Strategy Committee, a report, is it was based by stakeholders that weren't governments. Some of them were quasi-governmental institutions, and they were formed around a sector, not an amorphous sense of the Canadian economy.
Tabatha, you and I meet regularly with our counterparts from CFIB, from the Business Council of Canada, from the Retail Council of Canada, and from Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. At our last meeting a month or so ago, Dan Kelly from CFIB raised the possibility that we as a group could be sitting down and looking at, could we make recommendations to government that instead of boiling the ocean, as we had that discussion earlier, that there were immediate actionable items that the government could be looking at on the issue of labor to try to deal with the skills issue. Dan made one proposal that came up today, and that's that what is it that business and government could do working together to draw more retired workers back into the system, where you have an immediate pool of people in Canada already trained up and available, and could we bring them back into the workforce? You were talking earlier today about a number of areas in which we need to make improvements to how we provide educational and mentoring and other opportunities for Indigenous Canadians. What sort of a lag time is there? Are there measures that we could be recommending to the government that were much more short-term, where we would see the effects in terms of skills within the next 12 months?
Yeah, I think there's lots of programs that are out there that are building the Indigenous Skills and Employment and Training Program, but we're not getting that information to communities and to Indigenous people and to employers as well. So I think, and also small amount of, we don't need to put more funding into that program. We just need to make sure that that program is getting out to employers and to Indigenous people so they're understanding that that opportunity exists. But we also need to look at ways that we can partner better with academic institutions and employers to ensure that we're all able to access and work in that area together. I think the other thing, and we talked about this that day, is I think there's a lot, we understand that there's quite a few Indigenous people who might have got partway through a degree and found that it didn't work for them, that being in the city didn't work for them, that they didn't feel comfortable in the university or college, and that, you know, this was maybe 15, 20 years ago. So there are people who are partway through a degree that we could be able to get them to finish a degree now when the spaces in our academic institutions are more culturally safe, and when there is an opportunity to do some online schooling as well, so those people could stay in their communities. And I've had some conversations with academic institutions about this, about how do we find those people who are really close to finishing and welcome them back into institutions as well.
Thank you. Salim, either on the area of skills or in the area of innovation, are there short-term actionable measures that we could be recommending that we would see the impact of within the next 12 months?
Well, I think maybe one approach would be to actually talk to our government partners about what is working. And I brought up the Pan-Canadian AI strategy. I feel like there's not an awareness of just how effective that strategy was, the ripple effect it has caused around winning the war for talent, attracting investment, driving FDI into the country. I think that there is perhaps a conversation to be had around how could we use that as a bit of a playbook to perhaps apply to other industries and sectors, and to get all of our stakeholders engaged, which would include government, which would include educational partners, which includes the private sector, and try and replicate some of this success. And give credit where credit is due, because I think there have been some positive wins, but how do we build on that momentum? You know, I think we all are, frustrated in the fact that it feels like the pace of change is only continuing to get faster and faster and faster. I think we feel like Canada's role or opportunity to seize a leadership position is closing relative to other countries around the world. And so I think it's very easy to become pessimistic about trying to drive change. But I think if we can build on some of the things that have worked, try and use that to build some momentum, apply a bit of a playbook approach to some other sectors, and see if that can help drive both government momentum and private sector momentum. I wonder if that approach could work in terms of, you know, trying to activate more change or more development around some of these strategies than we've seen in the past.
Is my question about what we would say to the Deputy Prime Minister the wrong question, perhaps? Are we making a mistake, particularly those of us in the private sector, in saying this is essentially a government problem where we need government leadership as opposed to looking at ourselves?
Yeah, I would argue that I think all stakeholders have a role in being problem solvers in this new economic environment. And so I think what has happened in the last 10 or 15 years is it feels like all the stakeholders sometimes feel out of sync in the ideas and the programs and the things that we are measuring. It feels like we're not having the kind of intended impact that we had hoped for. And so I do feel like, you know, we have to do a better job at organizing ourselves, fighting for strategies and opportunities that would be relevant, and being able to roll up our sleeves and being a problem solver in trying to re-energize some of these sectors. I think all stakeholders have a role to play, and as we heard before, you know, sometimes this leadership takes 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but it takes that sort of consistent passion for what's important for this country and how to create opportunities for all that might be needed in order to really, you know, hit the message out of the park.
Can I press you a bit on the private sector here? Relative to our competitors, studies that have been done by parliamentary committees in the past have suggested that Canadian business underinvests when it comes to R&D, that we underinvest when it comes to upskilling and retraining our workforce, and that we underinvest in terms of machinery and equipment that would make us more competitive. Do you accept that criticism? And if so, why is this the case, and how do we fix it?
Yeah, I do accept it. I see with the innovators that I've worked with through my career and in my role at Mars, it's been thousands of innovators. I think there has been a common frustration across all the different sectors that Canadian opportunities are far and few in between, and there isn't the pace of adoption that they would see, the pace of experimentation that they would see in other markets, and so they have to turn their efforts to other markets to be able to build momentum. And as I said before, I think that the adoption reason sometimes exists because, first of all, may not be enough knowledge about what are the innovations or investments that could be made in order to help advance a particular business or a particular sector. So I think there is a knowledge gap that we need to start to close with industry, corporates as well as sort of small and medium enterprise. Secondly, even then, if they get excited about innovation, they may not have the talent to drive initiatives forward, and so we have to help figure out a plan to upskill, cross-skill, but help them bring in new talent in order to activate a plan to become a better adopter of innovation. Third, then, is they want to try and test some of these new innovations, but they may not necessarily have the budgets to activate pilot opportunities in order to prove an ROI that they can then use to scale a particular approach. And I think that's where we can have some programmatic opportunities to really help fund matchmaking between innovators and the business community. And I think that's some of what we see the superclusters doing today, is providing that type of matchmaking and funding some of these pilots that are going to be important. And then once, I think the adopters understand an ROI opportunity, how do we help them scale the adoption of an innovation? And sometimes that, again, becomes how do we get them access to capital? How do we get them access to talent so that they can more broadly deploy, an innovation within their business? And so I think we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to support the innovators. I think we now have to spend just as much time programmatizing and engaging industry to become better adopters and trying to solve some of these key inflection points that are going to be important. But I will say that, as I said before, I think that some challenges still exist. I think that in Canada, we just see a very different level of industry competitiveness relative to other countries. And so there isn't an urgency to adopt unless there are new competitors coming into the country, or unless our Canadian companies are looking to compete globally and they realize that the bar is much higher for what they need to be doing. And so how do we address this constant crisis of competition that sometimes slows down the adoption of innovation? That's one. Secondly is, how do we mobilize supply chains that are starting to modernize, that affect large companies and small companies, and how can we, in a more coordinated fashion, address the adoption process in order to make these companies better engaged in their supply chains? And then third is, how do we apply, creative approaches to regulatory environments, sandboxes, in order to provide some experimentation that gives them some flexibility for trial and error and learning in whatever industry that they're in. And we don't have those tools today to be able to push forward the work that we're seeing in different industries. So I think there could be a lot of work done on the adoption side in order to drive change.
Tabatha, coming back to Indigenous students in particular, Sharon was mentioning earlier the effort that was made jointly with other schools of business to go out and to explain to people the advantage of a business degree. Paul Martin has been very much engaged in the Martin Family Initiative to try to bring an exposure to business education into Indigenous communities and to Indigenous students. Why is the uptake at the provincial, this is provincial at the end of the day, why has the uptake been as low as it has been across the country? Why hasn't there been better support from provinces in introducing this sort of a program that would help Indigenous students to understand the opportunities in business? I was so struck when you talked about the fact that people can't find mentors, they can't find role models, and that it's difficult for them to have an understanding even of what business is all about. How can we improve that quickly?
Yeah, I think so. Paul Martin's Indigenous Entrepreneurship Program is an excellent curriculum. So it's a curriculum for grade 7 to grade 12, and it's in a lot of on-reserve schools because they're federally funded, but off-reserve schools with high populations of Indigenous people are provincially funded, and he needs the province to basically be able to pay for a teacher to be in that school. And it's funny because him and I have had this conversation, and my answer is always like, you're Paul Martin. You need me to help you get provinces on board. But I think it's the similar conversation that continues to happen around federal and provincial funding and who has the responsibility to First Nation people in this country. And it happens in every sector that we talk to. And I came from the energy sector, and when we were trying to get communities off diesel, the province, Ontario, continually said that's not our responsibility. That's a federal responsibility. So we definitely see that. There's also already a relationship, and Ontario just in 2019 announced a relationship in which if you were an on-reserve student going to an off-reserve school, the school board is now not allowed to overcharge the community for that student to go to school. So if you're an on-reserve student and go to school off-reserve, the community has to pay for that. And that is a very difficult relationship in a lot of provinces, between provinces and community. And there's quite a delay in getting those agreements so that communities can send their kids that are on reserve to off reserve. So I think that conversation around education and who's responsible for Indigenous education is still a very difficult one with the provinces. And the program has shown some real success in certain areas, particularly, in Thunder Bay, where the high school there, all of the communities and the remote communities send their students to that high school, and they've been able to do this Indigenous entrepreneurship curriculum that has Indigenous case studies that exemplifies, successful Indigenous businesses, so that those students can really see themselves in that situation. So we need to continue to see how much more we can get that into those schools. And I think in business schools as well, we need to include more Indigenous case studies within business school teachings. I've had the privilege of speaking at quite a few business schools just about our work and about Indigenous business and how many Indigenous businesses are in Canada, and just educating those students about the opportunities to work with Indigenous business, to support Indigenous business, and the real success. That education, and the students in all of those classes in MBA programs are so eager to learn about Indigenous history, and many of them are immigrants. And when I was first asked, I thought, there's no way I can talk for 3 hours. And it was 3 hours of questions from these students who just wanted to understand really what the Indigenous economy was like. If we can do that with younger students as well, I think we'll be a lot further ahead. But we need the provinces to come on board.
Certainly one of the points that Paul Martin has made when it comes to speaking to Indigenous students themselves is that the case models that people are given, the examples that they are given, are of non-Indigenous businesses led by non-Indigenous people, and that you need curricula which are culturally sensitive and which offer role models that people can identify with, that experiences that people can identify with. He also made the point that in his view, one of the difficulties with the provinces was that experience has shown that Indigenous students in a classroom context with non-Indigenous students will hold back, and as a consequence not have the same benefits. So it's important to have them in Indigenous classes, and the provinces are loath to do that because populations are too low in their view.
Yeah, so you need to have a certain number of Indigenous students in the school for them to consider supporting it, but they have really tried to ensure that only Indigenous students in the school can take that class so that they have the opportunity to feel more comfortable speaking. I mean, I'm doing my ICD right now, and I'm the last person to speak in that class. It's partially a cultural thing as well, that we're taught we have like 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. We should spend more time listening and less time speaking. So I completely understand that where he's going with that. And we talk about that even in high schools now that I support, and through my kids. We started an Indigenous student club, and there was a lot of parents who were upset that their non-Indigenous students couldn't participate because they wanted their students to be able to learn the culture as well. And we were very clear to say, no, this is supposed to be a space where they can learn on their own and be together. So we need to do more work to ensure that provinces understand that requirement.
Can we come back to the question of what we can recommend that is actionable now? We don't have any of the educators on this panel, but when Sharon gave the figures that after 5 years after graduation, 20% of the international students had permanent residency, and after 10 years it was 30%. I'm simply stunned by that. Why is that?
I think it's very difficult to get PR. I was talking to somebody at the break, and they said that the number of students coming in, like it's a mismatch of how many come in and how many are available through the quota system for PR. It's like we can't promise them that when they come in they'll ever get their PR because the numbers in the quota system for PRs are too small.
So, Peter, is this an area that's actionable?
Absolutely. As I said earlier, I think amongst the areas that I would focus on for that meeting are the human capital and the immigration. And it's not about the numbers. It's about the processing times, the student visas, the PR issues. I said to you in our meeting, why couldn't we see whether artificial intelligence could be utilized in the selection of migrants? There should be more innovation applied to the immigration processing. We're going to do 500,000 a year for the next number of years. It's worth investing in improved systems, not just adding on to the existing system.
We've got
because
somebody we can ask whether that would work. Salim, how about that?
Well, we first got to make sure that the website stays up when a new program launches and people are trying to apply. But yes, absolutely. If we thought more strategically, there is definitely a role, and there are solutions made by Canadians that can be focused on solving that
exactly.
problem. Yeah.
And immigration has always been a matter of risk management. It's never been perfect. Well, let's continue to identify it as a risk management proposition. But 30% is a horrible score.
Well, and it's so counterintuitive to me. When I was a university chancellor, I would sit at convocation, at the morning convocation, and look out at the international students there. And it struck me that if they would graduate in the morning, and if they could pass a security test over lunchtime, I would give them permanent residency by 2. Because if you look at it from a business perspective, what do we want? You want somebody who speaks English or French, somebody who is trained to Canadian standards, and somebody who's available. That, to me, is the definition of an international student. Our goal, yes, we still benefit when people go home, but this is a rich potential resource for us of people to help to meet our needs in Canada as well. And yet we don't have a strategy to see this as a resource that we want to be able to cultivate.
You've got two competing cultures. You've got the control culture of the immigration selection process and the integration demand of the domestic labor market, let alone self-interest. And that needs to be adjusted. And I think deploying of technology can help. Backlogs are destructive of public confidence in a system. And if we're going to welcome 500,000 immigrants a year, and I'm all for that, we have to tell Canadians that there's integrity in the process, and the immigrant experience cannot be as debilitating as it presently is when it takes 5 years to process some immigration streams, or the delays, the lack of sensitivity on the student side that there's competitive pressures, that not everybody wants to come to Canada as their only choice. They have other choices. And we in Canada feel no competitive pressure globally on any number of subjects. And that's all about incremental decline. We think we're better off because we're better off than we were, perhaps in some sectors, but our global advantage has declined. Look at all of the stats on global competitiveness. Somebody has got to start telling the truth. And that's not over-promising. And it's not saying it's all the Government of Canada's fault. But there's a collective need for a good civics lesson.
Perhaps we're victims of our own success. When you live in an orchard, you hold out your hand, an apple falls into it. You don't feel hungry the way that other people do.
Yeah.
In the rest of the world, people know that their effort is going to make the difference between lives of crushing poverty and lives of relative affluence. In Canada, we assume it's our birthright. And to instill that sense of urgency that we heard about so often over the course of the day is one of our challenges. Let's look at some of the other immediately actionable things. Steve also mentioned regulatory reform, and it came up in other contexts as well. Everybody's known that we had a sclerotic regulatory system. What was interesting was Chrystia Freeland's speech in Washington at the Brookings Institution, where she said, as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that we would fast track energy and critical minerals. Is one of those actionable items that we can put in front of her significant, immediate reform of the regulatory system to speed up the process? And we certainly heard through some of the panels about how slow we were relative to other countries.
I think so, but I would be very specific in pinpointing the sector or the suite of regulatory issues rather than a blanket statement on regulatory reform. Because for many governments, regulation is a public policy instrument of good. So regulation isn't inherently evil. It's when it's completely frustrating of a broader public policy objective. So choose your subjects that you think that there should be the urgency applied to that she has applied in light of the Russian initiative on certain fast tracking of projects. Well, let's identify them. I think that...
We start with the 3 F's: food, fuel, fertilizer. If there's something, and we heard about if Canada can't play a role in terms of agriculture today in the global economy, who can? If you look at the global needs and how geopolitics and the economy has changed since the invasion in February, food, fuel, fertilizer, of each of which Canada has an abundance, could be part of both an opportunity for Canada, but perhaps an obligation for us as well to meet the world's needs.
Yeah, I'd also point out Kevin's point on the health sector, which feds have a regulatory role in certain aspects of the health sector that has not been examined in light of the changing nature of not only health delivery, but the priority Canadians have for health. Well, that would be another one. Or Hassan's point about a tripartite approach to labor market issues. That's been in the mill for some years, and no action's ever been taken on it. There's now a private member's bill in the Senate on this. My point is that be specific and have thought through what is it that you're asking for, as opposed to regulatory reform has come up several times, and we think we need to have a red tape committee. No, that's not it.
Can we turn to the audience? Again, let me put the challenge to you that was put to us earlier. We're going to make a report to the Deputy Prime Minister. What do we recommend to her that she hasn't heard before and that she's going to be open to accepting and acting upon? Don't say, we need a plan. We heard that many times over the course of the day. This is the theme that I'm always on when I'm dealing with government. I accept that. We don't have a plan today. It's unlikely that we can have the debate as well about boiling the ocean, whether it's a grand scheme that we have and a broad vision, or whether it's something more narrow than that. But most significantly, what were the most important ideas that you heard today? And what is there that'll be fresh for her to hear that is actionable, and particularly items that are actionable within the next 12 months? Who'd like to start? Please, at the back of the room.
So, first of all, very good question. My idea would be that since we have already talked about immigration, how it can solve some of the problems, what I would suggest is that people, if they're coming in highly skilled person criteria, right? And if they already meet some criteria, they can fulfill some job requirements. There should be some kind of streamline or pipeline already in place when they land. They just get into the pipeline, they get upskilled, or if they have passed certifications, and then they start that particular job in that industry, so that there's no lag time. They don't get into some other services or some other jobs which they can't do. I think we also use our talent in that way as well.
Thank you. Other ideas? Please, over here.
Perhaps a recommendation for the federal government to fund universities. I'm going to make it funny. Have a time capsule creation so that people that are not born here or English is the second language to develop the emotional intelligence to communicate. Because you can get your degree from Ivy, that opens the doors, you go to the job interview, and then you don't get hired. And, oh, that was discrimination. No, it's the way you come out. You know how to present yourself. It's as simple as perhaps knowing how to handle the interview, personal brands, but there's an emotional component of how to make the point. And my daughter was born here, and she went, since kindergarten, she's learning how to express her emotions, how to breathe deep and calm herself, and then she uses the most precise words. I've been here 25 years, I don't have it. So I was always aware that I had to work harder to make the difference. And that's why I say time capsule. That beat is not just about the skills. It's not just about lowering the standards, which I hope we never do. It's about that very soft, impossible thing perhaps to do that when you come from the outside, like in my values, speaking in a blunt manner is applauded. Here is the worst thing you can do. So of course, if I go to a place, I sound different, I look different, and then I am abrasive, like who will hire me? I would not hire myself that way. So that gap is one of the reasons why after so many tries, is failure after failure, say, oh, this country is impossible. Discrimination is not discrimination, it's that it's just this simple little tweak that was so necessary at the beginning, especially when you go through school again, that for whatever reason you need to, like if you don't open your eyes to that, or your nature is not like that, you're not going to have it, and you're not going to be as successful as you could be.
Thank you. Other ideas? Please, sir.
If there are significant barriers to innovation or investment that could potentially unlock some economic potential in Canada, and it's seen that those barriers are significant between the three levels of government or between the provinces, I would offer that here in Ottawa, there's a unique construct with the NCC that could perhaps provide some form of pilot option to cut through some of that red tape potentially. And we do have technology and innovation industries in Ottawa whereby, perhaps there's option space for some testing of ideas from a policy perspective, whether it be Ontario-Quebec stuff or whether it be federal, provincial, municipal. So I'd offer that as an option, sir.
So innovative experimentation between different levels of government.
Through the NCC.
Other ideas? Sir, over here.
Hi, Dylan Glancy from ISED. We heard today about innovation ecosystems, but with all due respect, I don't think we really talked about innovation ecosystems and how these different pieces of the ecosystem actually work together. We had representatives from Communitech, Admare, and Mars, but we didn't talk about how you work together, nor how you work with the NRC for scaling up companies with the IRAP program, nor with colleges who are great innovation intermediaries as well, who can help businesses scale. And colleges also have a role of educating Indigenous people where they're actually overrepresented rather than in universities where they're very underrepresented. So I think there's a role for working together and sharing best practices and actually passing people in between these different parts of the innovation ecosystem.
Salim, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think I can speak firsthand. I know that in the years that I spent at Mars, the first part of my journey, it was very competitive amongst the different ecosystems, and it felt like everyone was doing their own kingdom building. And then I think what we found out that that if we were to pool our expertise, our talent pools, our access to customers and capital and talent, that the approach would be stronger, the message would be stronger, and we'd have a bigger impact. And I'd say the last part of my time at Mars, we did a lot collaborating with Communitech, with Invest Ottawa, with the other innovation hubs across the country. We were able to unlock federal funding to help support that collaboration, really focus on who was good in which sector, and let that group be the lead. We don't have to be great in every sector. And I would say that I felt positive when I left Mars that we were heading in the right direction, and there was a greater spirit of collaboration and a greater spirit that there was room for everyone to be successful in lifting the innovation ecosystem. So I think it's always a work in progress, but I felt that we were making some impact on that.
Other ideas? Please, over here.
Great. So I think there were some good points made too around access to capital. And I don't think it's so much the government providing the capital, but perhaps creating the environment, and it's perhaps a tax mechanism so that that capital can fund the ideas and the innovation. The other thing I would challenge this group around, and it was an idea that was brought forth, is that we need to tell the broader community why this is so important, because maybe the non-business community is skeptical of why the government should create tax incentives to free up this capital. But I think we as a community need to tell them, sort of like the tour Tom and Jack did, going across the country telling the problems of deficit. But let's tell them the good stories of why allowing tax advantages around capital investment is so important, because it seemed to be a gap that was noted this morning. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Other suggestions? Sharon.
I'm very much in favor of a national strategy for recruiting international students and making sure that the numbers are all aligned, so that if we're looking at a $5 million people population that's growing by 50% in the next 10 years, we should be trying to get 10% of that population to come to Canada. So build a national strategy to market it. Make sure we've got the visa system to intake, and then align the PR numbers so that these students are interested in coming and have a viable journey when they get here.
And there is no national strategy?
There's no national strategy.
You remind me of when I was in Singapore with the Governor General, David Johnston, some years ago. In the top of the Straits Times, there was an ad that said, "Future Unlimited, get an Australian degree." I was struck that that was Australia advertising in Singapore on the front page of a newspaper. When I came back, I spoke to the Australian High Commissioner and said, "Tell me about what you're doing." Her response was, "Canada has exactly the same competitive advantages as Australia. But you won't market yourself on the basis of individual institutions rather than first Canada." Said the first thing that any parent looks at before they send their child to the other side of the world, it's not where's the best education, it's where will they be safe. And then after that, they ask the question of what institution will give the best education. But the point she was making is that brand Canada is the key here that we should be promoting, and that there has to be some coherence in that, as opposed to each institution going out for itself and competing with each other. So I think that's Sharon, it's a very good suggestion, I think. Sir.
Just building off that point, actually, maybe some kind of incentive for educational institutions here, technical schools, universities, to partner with institutions where we have large populations of refugees living. And so you could imagine a university here partnering with a university, for example, in Turkey, where there's a lot of refugees living, and actually boosting the capacity of the educational institution there, and also getting an early track on some of those individuals, and make up lost time for the loss of education for a lot of young people that have been missing out because of the challenge of the last several years.
Thank you. Other ideas? Sir.
Just follow up on the same token. I'm just going to give an example to myself. Actually, I'm from Turkey, and when I was finished engineering degree, I wanted to come to graduate school for North America, and I got accepted from UBC and a few other U.S. schools. But my Canadian visa was almost locked up for 3-4 weeks, and I was about to go to U.S., and in return, I was able to get the visa. But just one moment. Anyway, so the short story long, everything worked great. But the second time when I was finishing UBC, they gave me 90 days to find a job. Otherwise, I was going to get deported. So my point is, it's much easier to get students in Canada to PR status and visa rather than actually trying to recruit. I have a postdoc who's an expert in optimization, and we are trying to get a PR status for the last year. I would just take him and beg him and use him. So it's kind of really frustrating to deal with PR and visa status. Actually, we should be able to get people inside Canada first, much easier. Of course, we should get everybody, but inside Canada, we should have a really good strategy.
Peter, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. One of my recent themes is the difference between poetry and plumbing. And Ottawa is very good at poetry, and we've degraded the plumbing system. And I think one of the themes to the Deputy Prime Minister would be, in the various programs that have been raised, the plumbing isn't world class. So it's not that the policy on immigration, numbers or students, all this sort of stuff, it's that the plumbing is 1960s plumbing. And we need to upgrade the plumbing on this issue or the human capital issues that we raised earlier. I think that's a theme that at the higher level would play in a number of sectors that the Department of Finance would not welcome hearing, but needs to hear. And if I could add totally differently, if this was a group anywhere west of Winnipeg, they would say that reference earlier to net zero and the implications of net needs to be added to this just for regional balance and the innovation that would release if we actually had that utterance at a very high level of government.
And I would think that with the Deputy Prime Minister hailing from originally from Alberta, that she would have some openness to thinking about that.
I would hope so, and not have to go to Brookings to make that speech.
Yeah. Who else? Suggestions? Otherwise, over here, sir. Because otherwise I'm forced to go back to Steve and ask him for other quick-term, short-term measures.
One thing we haven't talked about is setting an R&D goal, like a lot of countries have done, where you just say like, oh, we should spend X% of our GDP on R&D. It's an option. It's not a great one.
All suggestions gratefully received.
Actually, in the Senate report, that was one of the indices that we said we should be committing to. We broke it up into global competitive economic growth objectives, employment training and talent attraction objectives, R&D and technical adoption, and sustainability. And in each we had about 3 indices that we as a country should say these are our objectives, and then get the stakeholders around. But I think that is one, because earlier we talked about the GERD and the BIRD. And our numbers are good on the GERD, but not so good on private sector.
So the suggestion I have is our Canadian pension funds, they're really well, and they're some of the biggest and best in the world. But a lot of times what they do is they'll invest in other parts of the world because the return on investment is much higher. So I think one thing that'd be good is allowing Canadian pension funds, or maybe creating a special incentive for them to invest within Canada, or give them like a tax break or something along those lines that would benefit the country because
They don't pay taxes.
it will essentially allow capital to come out and then they'll be able to invest in R&D and stuff like that, and that would essentially create a virtuous cycle for us.
Thank you. I think gentleman back here.
We need a plan. No, I'm kidding. No, so I think that what Angela was saying earlier really resounded with me about like a smart immigration kind of data-driven approach to match immigrants with really high demand areas in Canada. So an actual mechanism to do that. I used to manage warehouses with like 150 to 200 packers, and in my warehouse there would be people who were doctors, engineers, and all of that coming to Canada who didn't, again, qualify for Canadian standards. So I think having a clearer approach before they come, like that gentleman over there said earlier, would really help.
Thank you. Tom DeQuino, you have had lots of experience going to the Deputy Prime Minister and others with suggestions. If you were making recommendations for measures she could be taking in the short term in her next budget, which would have an impact within the next 12 months on innovation or on skills, what would be a recommendation you would make? And a microphone's just coming up to you right now.
Perrin, I thought I shot my bolt at lunchtime, so I was listening and collecting. What I would do, and this,
out of short on ideas.
I know we're talking about the Deputy Prime Minister, but we'd have to ask ourselves the question, I mean, the real boss is the Prime Minister. So I would first of all demand that there be two people at the meeting, the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. Secondly, I would say, forget 32 positions in cabinet. I would reduce them probably down to 6. A minister responsible for trade, because right now we are dealing with our most important trading partner. We've heard very little about trade today, and we have no idea what is coming. We went through a near-death experience with Mr. Trump, which could have been existential, at least in trade terms. And therefore, yes, I know we talk about an Indo-Pacific strategy. We've been waiting for it for how long? You just come back from Bali. You've been meeting with all sorts of other people. You know how aggressive many of our partners are around the world. In preparing for the future, I would say, going forward, let's really, really get serious, putting resources, time, energy, branding into where we go on trade. The second thing would be the innovation agenda. And there I would say, we've had so many good ideas today, some of them very granular. I found that the discussion today was very beneficial to me because of its granularity, something that I think Ivy is famous for, and I think in that regard today was very productive. We know how important people are in this. We know that many, we've heard it now, we've heard it in earlier panels, what some of those clear and short-term recommendations should be. And I would say, let's pick those 3 or 4 or 5, and let's really make it work. Infrastructure, you and I know, wherever we travel in the world, I mean, our lunch is being eaten when it comes to infrastructure. You talk about countries we want to live in. I mean, I just came back from a week in Vienna, voted 8 years in a row as the most livable city in the world. Why? Superb transportation system, an ability to infuse both their cultural endowments with their economic endowments. We can learn from these things, and when it comes to infrastructure, you may say, well, why aren't we doing better? You and I know an individual who not too long ago had to make a big decision as to whether that company was going to invest $1 billion in Canada in a mining venture, or whether it was going to go to Chile. That individual went to see the Deputy Prime Minister and maybe the Prime Minister, I believe the Prime Minister, to say, look, we cannot live with 7- and 8-year time frames to tell us whether we're going to get the project or not. That's not the way the world works today. So the regulatory impediments, that incidentally, that decision was made to take the $1 billion to Chile. That's another case of having lost an opportunity. Why? Because for a whole variety of reasons, increasingly complex, we've imposed on ourselves these impediments to getting things done. Smaller things and also the very, very big things. We won't get into Trans Mountain. We won't get into why, at a time when Europe is facing a major energy crisis, we have not been able to build another Trans-Canada pipeline, that takes oil and gas and other minerals to the East Coast, let alone being able to build LNG plants. As a young lawyer, I was working with a man in Vancouver in 1977 looking at LNG. And how many this is 2022, how many of them have we built? So infrastructure is important. And finally, one that you were close to at one time in your life, which we have not talked about, and that is the defense of the country. Our country is in a very, very weak position in an increasingly dangerous world. We have on our northern border an aggressive nuclear power. We do not have the capability to even remotely come close to defending our shorelines. We have to rely on the Americans. I have no idea where the Great Republic is going or whether there'll even be a Great Republic 10 or 15 years from now as we know it. So again, we have to become more self-reliant. So a Minister of Defense, one of infrastructure, certainly one of innovation, one on trade, and one on health, because the last thing I want to mention is health. Our healthcare is broken. We're struggling. Everybody knows it is. Every day we pick up a newspaper to tell us that the healthcare is broken. There are many, many solutions, good ones that come forward, and yet almost no action to deal with it. Are we at that existential point now where finally we're going to see something happen? I thought we were there 4 or 5 years ago, and still we're not fixing it. So those are maybe the 6 or 7 portfolios. Everybody else, some of those things are relevant, but that's what I would really concentrate our firepower on.
Thanks, Tom. Let's wrap up where we began with Steve. You put out the challenge to us about the handful of actionable items that we take to the Deputy Prime Minister. At the end of the day, having heard all of this, all of these ideas, what are the ones you would take?
Okay, well, my head is about to explode with the ideas. It's been very, very productive. As Tom said, I love the granularity that we picked up today. So I just know that some of that is going to be seen as really attractive stuff. Okay, so it could be, they sound like little things, but little things add up to big things. So, and Tom has said it so well, I don't really want to go back into that. Just say that we've seen today probably 20 things that we could put on a list. I know the gang is going to debate about what sort of list we should deliver. We may go with 2 forms, a long form and a short form, because there's so many good ideas. But the point is that the door is open. You say, maybe we should be talking to so-and-so and so-and-so. That's all well and good. The door is open for this to be delivered. So we're going to deliver it that way. Yeah, I don't have any favorites. I mean, there's all of the stuff about trade, as you know, and about picking up the money off the sidewalk and all those things. They can sound abstract, and that's why we need to make them specific. Just do this. It'll cost nothing. Provinces actually might agree with it. Wouldn't that be something? How many times, though, did we hear? Well, we can't probably solve that because that's actually a provincial jurisdiction. Tabatha, I mean, it just drives me crazy. So, and you began with that earlier today. We have a federation. That's how it works. And so we have to find ways to create stronger incentives for these things to work better. And who else but the feds? That's they're dishing out money every day without the sorts of incentives I think that they could create. So I know that's all kind of vague. I know, literally, I'm not kidding. My head's going to explode, and my preoccupying thought right now is that the bar is open. Okay, that's really what's on my mind about now. But I want to just take this to congratulate the team on putting on a heck of a great day. I loved the panels. The selection of people for the panels were fantastic, and the audience just came out and spoke up. It was absolutely fantastic. Thank you, everybody.